Good morning, everyone. I invite you to take your seats so we can get started. Okay, we'll start with declarations of interest. Seeing none, confirmation of minutes 27 from October 19th, 2017. Carried. We have two regrets from Councillor Shirelli and Councillor Kadri, who's away on city business. Communications as listed, I think there's a desire to lift some of them. Councillor Fleury.
Oui, Madame la Présidente, j'aimerais soulever le thème au niveau des Pawnbrokers Act et puis j'ai deux réponses au inquiry que j'aimerais discuter publiquement.
Okay, so it takes 2/3 to lift. Councillor Fleury is asking to lift the first one, service agreements with the Salvation Army, and also the fourth one, emergency shelters. Is everyone in agreement to lift those items? Agreed? Okay. Item number 1, Arts, Culture, Heritage, and Recreation Advisory Committee 2015-2016 Annual Report. Received?
Received.
Okay, and then the IPD's Vehicle for Hire Bylaw 1-year update. Councillor Brockington is asking to lift. Again, it takes 2/3. Carried. And B, review of the Provincial Pawnbrokers Act. And Councillor Fleury is asking to lift that item. Agreed? Yeah. Agreed. Okay, then we'll return to the first held item. I think, Councillor Fleury, you've indicated that you're going to ask your questions at the same time to both of the two items, so go ahead, the floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Oui, les deux systèmes, juste pour que les gens qui écoutent puissent être au courant, c'est deux systèmes qui sont intitulés « Accord des services avec l'Armée du Salut ». Et il y en a un qui c'est une réponse qu'on a reçue le 13 septembre 2017. C'est au niveau des refuges d'urgence. J'ai quelques questions pour Janice à ce sujet-là. Comme vous savez, on est depuis l'acte 2000 qui s'appelle le Social Housing Reform Act, on a une responsabilité de service manager. Alors, on doit démontrer un leadership dans le secteur. On doit coordonner les services, ce qui est clair, là, il n'y a pas de débat là-dessus. Moi, ma question, parmi mes débuts de questions, c'est vraiment au niveau, je comprends qu'on a une entente de service pour que les gens qui couchent dans les refuges, qu'on paye les organisations 44 $ par soir, par nuit. Mais ma question est vraiment au niveau des refuges sont planifiés pour être d'urgence. Et puis, quand on revient au Reform Act, on dit on doit l'aider. Alors, moi, j'ai une question pour la Ville de comprendre à quel moment est-ce qu'on définit qu'une personne dans un refuge n'est plus en situation d'urgence, puis qu'il doit y avoir une implication de la Ville. Ce que je veux dire, c'est que les refuges, puis je parle de façon générale, je sais que là, on a le dossier de l'Armée du Salut, mais je pense que c'est important d'avoir une version plus large de la discussion. Les refuges n'ont pas nécessairement, même s'ils travaillent de bonne foi, même si c'est des organismes à but non lucratif, souvent la majorité des fonds, c'est soit de la Ville ou des donateurs. Je suis un peu bouleversé du fait qu'on n'a pas des objectifs plus clairs afin de réduire le nombre de gens dans les refuges. Il y a des gens qui se retrouvent dans les refuges pour plusieurs mois, plusieurs années. On appelle ça des chronically homeless. Puis, ce que je remarque, c'est qu'on n'a pas d'attente claire dans les ententes sur une période où il y a des mesures extraordinaires qui sont prises afin d'aider les gens et les mettre dans des situations plus stables. Alors, j'aimerais comprendre comment, en tant que service manager dans l'acte, le Social Housing Reform Act, on est en lien avec ça, mais qu'on ne cible pas des objectifs plus directs avec nos ententes.
Madam Chair, so there was a series of questions. I'm just going to, can we move the chair so I can, okay, thank you. So I can, just a minute. OK, merci, conseiller Fleury. Social Assistance Reform, the Social Housing Reform Act et maintenant le Housing System Act. Et les demandes dans cet acte-là, c'est d'avoir un plan pour housing et homelessness. C'est la seule indication. Il n'y a pas de mention pour les refuges dans l'acte comme tel. En tant que les changements, les objectifs pour les différents refuges, il s'agit d'un contrat. Et à ce moment-là, je demanderai à Shelley de venir nous parler des objectifs qui sont dans le contrat pour les différents refuges.
Good morning, through you, Madam Chair. So the contract as it relates to the Salvation Army in terms of the emergency shelter contract basically lays out that the emergency shelters are to deliver...
Shelley, can I just, we've talked about enough about the Salvation Army. To me, I want to take it up a notch. To me, it's about the 8 providers. I think it applies equally to the 8 providers. So that's how you highlighted in the memo. On page 3, which highlights the Ottawa Mission, Salvation Army, Shepherds, Cornerstone, Catholic Center for Immigration, St. Mary's, Youth Services Bureau, YMCA. So I've talked enough about the Salvation Army the last 2 days. I think I want to elevate the conversation around what is the expectation and results within the agreement, within what we have to do as a service manager.
So in regards to the emergency shelter contracts that we have with the 8 providers that you mentioned, the contracts lay out a suite of activities that the providers of said services are to provide under the contract. For instance, they provide shelter, they provide food, and they provide case management services. They're compensated as per it's laid out in the agreement. Some are compensated with a per diem amount of $44 a day. Others are compensated via an operating subsidy. In some of the contracts that we have now, people are actually paying room and board, and the city is providing an operating subsidy to further offset their costs. In regards to the outcomes, there's no specific outcomes in the sense of if you're asking me that they must house, X people per year, or they must deliver X services. It's basically that they must deliver food, shelter, and case management supports.
Yeah, and that's clear. When you say that under the city conducts a variety of emergency shelter inspections, that's maybe where I'm more interested in that component, which is maybe you can elaborate on what the 30 months housing services compliance review means.
So the emergency shelters are governed by a set of emergency shelter standards that were approved by City Council in 2005. So we go in and we do a 30-month assessment. We do a series of, standards reviews, we would call them, to ensure that they're in compliance with what's set out in the emergency shelter standards. So are they delivering services in accordance to their agreement? Ottawa Public Health goes in and does a public health inspection. So it's basically, are they in alignment with what's outlined in the emergency shelter standards?
So the 8 providers are offering very needed services to our most vulnerable. There's no question there. But one of the key indicators, and it's the following paragraph, the payments or the payment for emergency shelter beds. And that's what I want to narrow in on, which is at what point is someone in a shelter, but it's becoming more of a unit, more of a house, and less temporary. And if that's the case, then what's our role as service manager to ensure that, okay, we do case, is there proper case management completed? Do we have proper tracking of, is there a unit available for that person? Like the feeling I have is that we keep people in shelter for too long, and that we don't have the right hook, if you will, in our agreements that enables us to have proper oversight of the folks that have been in shelter for an extended period.
So we are becoming more sophisticated, absolutely. Shelters have been de facto homes for people for years. What we've started implementing are the housing first principles. Those include diversion at the front door, a line of inquiry where people, we explore with people, do they have other safe options, number one, and they're required to report to us, back to us in terms of their diversion strategies and outcomes. The other one is that common assessment tool. So it's not just one homogeneous group. It's essentially you look at each individual, you take this common assessment tool, and from there you determine if they have high, low, medium acuities or high, low, medium needs, if you will. And from there, an expectation is that you develop plans to house people. The housing would happen much more quickly if there was enough supply, and there is not enough supply of affordable housing. And for some people that have the higher needs, you don't only need the supply of affordable housing, but you also need the supports, and whether it's in a private setting or in social housing. And for some people, that is not even enough. Then you need full supportive housing where people live at what some people call as a group home, but it's a supportive, permanent supportive housing. And everyone is working towards those goals. We've had those conversations. We've been practicing housing first for many, many years, and that is the expectation of all of the providers.
So I'm unclear as to what is the incentive for one of those providers to house a person. In a weird way, they lose an income.
Well, the common assessment tool that is done is information that's shared with the city, and we, as the Housing Services Branch, have the responsibility to receive all of those names and match them as the supports and as the housing becomes available. We're the one that control that internally. So that's how we're assured that these folks, as the supply is available and the supports are available, are matched and moved to and transitioned to permanent housing.
But what we've learned over the last few weeks is what you're describing makes sense to me, but then how does a provider like Action Housing come into play? Because they seem to be maybe duplicating some of those efforts or creating a parallel to those services, no?
I would suggest that Action Logement or Housing Help is not likely supporting the homeless population. They're supporting folks that are precariously housed, maybe new people coming to the city of Ottawa that are looking for housing. I would suggest that those are the majority of the people that they're serving, and not the homeless population. So
just can we go back then? So anyone that's homeless, we have an understanding of what pool of units are available. And obviously they're in the service providers, and then we control the flow out of the shelter into the units?
Correct.
That is the city that controls that?
Correct.
Okay, that's clear. It wasn't clear in the response.
Sure.
I apologize, Madam Chair, I just wanted some clarity on how we set the outcomes. I guess since we control the flow, we can control how quick people are properly housed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fleury. Anyone else? So received on those two items? Received. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is a vehicle for bylaw hire 1-year update, and where are they? Is Mr. Chapman in the room? So, Mr. Chapman, we're on the vehicle for hire bylaw 1-year update, and we'd just like to invite you to make some opening comments.
So, Madam Chair and members committee, thank you for this opportunity today to present the one-year update on the Vehicle for Hire bylaw. I'd like to take this opportunity first to thank a few people, Christine Harteg for her involvement in the development of this report, as well as Ryan Perot and the rest of the BSS team and EPS for their assistance as well. So briefly outline each of the areas on which Council provided direction to report at the one-year mark, specifically private transportation company usage and compliance, accessibility undertakings, in particular the voluntary per-trip surcharge, licensing initiatives for low-emission vehicles, and in-vehicle cameras for PTC vehicles. Since the bylaw took effect on September 30th, 2016, 2 PTC companies have registered and met all licensing requirements. Uber Canada Inc. and more recently, Teslift, a small boutique service utilizing the Tesla electric car, which has completed a negligible number of trips to date. The majority of the trips have been completed through Uber. As you can see, these are largely concentrated in the downtown core, but do extend throughout the city. The data transfers and auditing process involving Uber have been working efficiently and effectively. Close to 2,000 audits on driver records have shown that Uber's compliance has been very high, more than 99%. Spot checks and focused enforcement programs have shown similar high level of compliance for PTC drivers. Our auditing and enforcement have proven effective in identifying issues, albeit few, and Uber has demonstrated a high degree of cooperation in resolving any matters that do occur. In regards to the voluntary per-trip surcharge for accessibility, staff has petitioned the province to make the necessary legislative changes to make the fee mandatory. We are not aware that any such changes are in the works at this time. In the interim, we have reached an agreement with Uber Canada to provide a voluntary 7-cent per trip surcharge retroactively to the date of the issuance of this license, October 4th, 2016. The total value of the surcharge for the first year is approximately $450,000. Bylaw and Regulatory Services continue to support the General Manager of Emergency and Protective Services as stakeholder consultations are undertaken. A report to Committee and Council is anticipated for the spring of next year. In response to Council's direction regarding licensing initiatives for hybrid, electric, and low-emission vehicles, staff examined existing government initiatives, cost savings, industry trends, as well as the licensing mechanism included in the former taxi bylaw. We found that existing financial incentives of up to $15,000 provided by the province, as well as the operational savings from operating a hybrid or electric vehicle, eclipsed any financial incentive that could be achieved through a 2-tiered licensing system. Important to note is the average per trip fee that the city collects from a PTC driver amounts to only about $200 per year. In addition, we note that the sales of hybrid and electric vehicles have continued to rise, and that a number of manufacturers have committed to only producing low-emission vehicles beginning as soon as 2019. While we do not have the data on the existing number of hybrids used by PTC drivers in Ottawa, one telling measure is the number of electric-only vehicles currently in use. By counting the number of electric-only models in our vehicle data, we discovered that Uber drivers here in Ottawa are 3 times more likely to drive electric vehicles than the national average. The previous taxi bylaw allowed smaller, low-emission vehicles to be used on the taxi fleet through the vehicle standards provisions of the bylaw. The new Vehicle for Hire bylaw, all those former requirements have been removed in their entirety, so that any vehicle, taxi, limousine, or PTC, can operate a low-emission vehicle. These broader standards, which are already in place, when coupled with the existing financial incentives, and when considering the licensing restrictions that have already been removed from the bylaw, have led to the conclusion that that further licensing incentives would have negligible impact. Staff was also asked to report on the adoption of in-vehicle cameras requirements for PTC vehicles, specifically if cameras are required for passenger safety, and if lower cost alternatives to the approved taxi cameras could be utilized. An important consideration in this regard is the key differences between the PTC and taxis operating models, which forms the basis of Council's overall policy approach. PTC platforms, by design, have enhanced features to identify both the driver and passenger and provide consumer protection in a form of driver ratings and reporting problems to the licensee. PTC customers have the means to verify all the driver information before choosing to get into the car. PTC drivers are not permitted to accept street hails or cash fares in the same way that taxis can, so they are similarly protected. To date, staff have not received any complaints regarding public safety or violations of law committed by PTC licensee. In response to the question of whether or not a less expensive camera option exists for PTC drivers, staff could not identify any less expensive camera that meets the same requirements of those required by the taxi industry. Requirements in the in-vehicle cameras, such as only making images available to law enforcement, are not negotiable. Similarly, the ability to not turn off or disable the camera, which is important for law enforcement, raises serious privacy concerns for vehicles where the primary use is private transportation. Given the key differences between PTCs and taxis and the previously noted requirements for cameras, and the fact that there is no jurisdiction that requires in-vehicle cameras for PTC vehicles, staff is recommending against any such requirements here in Ottawa. This concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Chief Chapman. Before we go to questions to staff, there is one delegation that would like to address, two delegations now that would like to address the committee. So we'll start with Tony Hajar. And Mr. Hajar, if you just come to the seat right here where it says public delegations. And Mr. Hajar will be followed by Kathy Bunka. Good morning, Mr. Hajar. You have 5 minutes to address the committee. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm so dismayed because of all this information that we had just heard. The unfortunate thing is all this information is coming from Uber, and I am sure Uber is not ready to divulge any information about all the incidents that happens in their cars. And I don't know if the council see what's in the news, especially in the last couple of months, about all the sexual assaults and sexual harassments that is happening in Uber cars. There's also so many other incidents that need to be addressed, but what I am hoping to ask from council is if they really want to hear the true facts of what's happening in Uber cars, is maybe the city can set up a complaint line just like they have a complaints line against taxi drivers. Maybe they can use the same line in order to see the complaints or compliments that are happening about Uber drivers. There's also another thing that the 1 year review about Uber, but you did not set up a 1 year review about what's happening to the taxi industry and what's happening to the taxi drivers with the bylaws that have been implemented at the same time that Uber was legalized. When you council said that they were going to level the playing field to let us compete against Uber, when in fact there are few bylaws there that literally tied our hands behind our back in order to compete. Our expenses skyrocketed like crazy, one because of the insurance and a few other things like the car age limit. You allowed the car to be driven for up to 10 years, but it still has to be less than 5 years to go online. Now many drivers have cars with 800,000 kilometers on it that they can still drive for 2 more years, but they cannot buy another car with the same age to put online. It has to be less than 5 years. So I'm here to ask of council to, please, if you want to do the review, set up the line, a complaints line to really see the true facts of what Uber is.
Is that it, Mr. Hajar?
Yes.
Is there any questions for the delegation? Seeing none, we'll move to our next delegation, Kathy Bunka from Hopen Inc.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hajar.
Good morning. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is, first of all, Kathy Bunka. I'm representing a European rideshare service. And firstly, I'd like to thank the members of the Community and Protective Services Committee for attention to this matter, for a comprehensive report on the Vehicle for Hire bylaw after a little over a year of implementation. I understand at the same time the reticence to open up the bylaw to amendments. There were many hearings, there were many concerns from a number of stakeholders in Ottawa during the period when the bylaw was being drafted and considered and agreed to. At the same time, in the interest of introducing more competition and better prices and safer service to consumers in the City of Ottawa, it is in the interest of the Council to do so. At some point, I would urge members of the committee to consider opening the session up to new hearings. There are certain issues I know have been raised, such as soft meters in taxis, and this needs to be considered. And there are also barriers to entry for newcomers that the main service in Ottawa, the Uber rideshare ride-hailing service, did not face. They were operating on the market for a number of years without a bylaw in place. And the fact that there are certain conditions now is a barrier to entry for newcomers. I would also urge you to be open to new business models. And again, the interest is to improve the security to the consumer and to improve the competition, because at a certain point, if polling was done, I think you would find that the prices are rising. Uber's principle of surge pricing sometimes exceeds the regular taxi meter fares. And I think a number of these issues should be discussed and can be addressed through consultations. So thank you very much for your attention. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bunka. Don't go away. There's a question for you. Councillor Regley.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
You had, part of your presentation, you said be open to new business models. So how are you different from what Uber does? I'm assuming you're putting yourself in that pot of new business models.
I'm putting this European ride-hailing service in that category of a new business model. I'd prefer not to present it to the council at this time, but it's related to the soft meter concept where taxi companies would be able to use an application for their service. You might be aware that a number of taxi companies in the city are using a French-based ride-hail service called eCab, which doesn't meet the requirements of the PTC model. For example, this application that is being widely used right now in the city does not provide a cost estimate in advance of the ride, does not provide you with a photograph and a vehicle license plate of the driver who will pick you up. So the ride-hailing service is evolving, and the bylaw needs to keep pace.
So I appreciate you don't want to present today, but so if I understand, you're not a transportation service, you're a tech service. Is
We
that
are a
correct?
tech IT application service, correct?
So you wouldn't be putting cars on the road, you'd be putting technology in the cars.
Precisely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Regla. Anyone else? Thank you, Ms. Bunka, for being here this morning. Okay, those are our public delegations. We're just going to go to questions from committee members now, but before we do, I just wanted to clarify something that Mr. Hajar said when he spoke. He said that there's a complaint line, complain about taxi drivers, but not for PTCs. And I just wanted to get some clarification. Is that because we license the company when it comes to PTCs and we license the drivers in the taxi business, or can you just give us some clarity?
Yes, Madam Chair, so the tariff cards that are posted in the vehicles are clear. Any complaints are be called through 311, so that would be the complaint hotline.
Okay, but does 311 receive complaints about Uber drivers or PTC drivers, or they govern themselves because we only license the company? Is that what Mr. Hajar is talking about?
I'm not sure what he was talking about a complaint hotline. I mean, 311 is the number to call. I'm sure that there
But
have been...
if I had a complaint about an Uber driver, can I call 311 and you will chase that down, or you will just refer that to Uber?
So depending on what the complaint is, there's two ways. They can do their own rating through the app when they exit the vehicle, or they do have the option of calling Uber directly and filing a complaint.
But not to the city?
No, if the call came into 311, they would be referred to Uber to call Uber.
Right, because we license the PTC, not the drivers.
Unless the complaint was specific to street hailing, cash, any of those provisions of the bylaw that we enforce on the drivers.
Right, and so when you spoke, you said that we had not received any complaints about Uber, but is that because we don't receive complaints?
Oh, sorry, Madam Chair, I was referring to safety complaints, so more criminal matters,
Okay.
you know, where drivers felt that their safety was in jeopardy.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Brockington.
I think that just opens up a greater can of worms that we have to explore this morning. First of all, the report is silent on how many trips there were in the given year, and I've done some rough math. You indicate how many are in the downtown core, 2.7 million. We collect $450,000 based on a 7-cent per ride. That's 6.4 million trips in the year. Is that an accurate number?
That is correct, 6.36 million trips in 1 year.
So that's a pretty good data set to use to analyze in our first year. How did you conclude that there is no evidence to support the need for in-vehicle cameras? What were all the sources you went to get data from to make that conclusion?
Madam Chair, there were a few things that were considered, one being the model for PTCs, and the fact that the app is available for any rider. The relationship between the rider and the driver is established before the rider gets into the vehicle, so they know who the driver is.
We already know that. We knew that before the first year started. So we were expecting a report at the end of the first year that looked at incidents in these vehicles, 6.4 million rides, and you were asked, and this was reconfirmed after the 3-month mark, about how you were going to analyze over the first year and all the different possible sources of where this information comes from. That's silent in the report. So how did you conclude after 6.4 million rides that cameras are not required? Forget the model. Explain to me your detailed discussions with the Ottawa Police about matters that have been reported. Explain to us about complaints that have been received in detail. You can't tell me that 6.4 million rides there have been no incidents, because there have been. So I want to know how you came to this conclusion. That's what I'm looking for.
Madam Chair, it is our conclusion that complaints concerning safety of either the driver or the rider, we have not received any complaints, 0 complaints. We have received complaints about, the cash handling, utilizing taxi stands, hailing fares, those type of complaints we have received. We also do some auditing on the driver ratings, so we know that when those complaints are received by Uber, the driver ratings are reduced. So we have done some analysis on those audits on the driver ratings as well, which would indicate that there hasn't been any significant complaints.
But have you met with Uber at the end of the year and said, all right, you've had 6.4 million trips, talk to us about incidents that have been reported with you. How can we work better with you to address incidents that are taking place? Have you sat down with the Ottawa Police to have those same discussions? I know police will say we can't get into the details about issues that have been reported. I'm not looking for names, addresses, locations. I'm looking for whether or not there have been assaults, physical assaults or sexual assaults. I'm looking for inappropriate behaviors. That's what I'm looking for. And we made it very clear of what we were expecting at the end of the first year. And so I'm not here as a proponent of cameras or not. I want to make sure that after the first year of a brand new PTC company, we took a decision not to have cameras in the car, but we said we want to make sure that our decision, that we're comfortable with our decision. And we'll make that decision after the year. We have 6.4 million trips to make, I think, a very comprehensive decision. And I understand that complaints to the city directly have been low or nil. Doesn't mean there haven't been other inappropriate complaints filed. But I just want to make sure from you that you've done a comprehensive review with Uber, with the police, with other sources, so that when you say there's no evidence, I'm comfortable with that statement.
Madam Chair, I guess the model that was passed by Council last October, the model is that those complaints go directly to the licensee. Because we don't license the individual drivers, that information's not readily available to us. So Uber to date has not provided us with any number of complaints, or provided us a number of complaints that they have received as a company.
Okay, that's fair. And police, just yes or no, have you met with the police after the year to review matters that have been brought to their attention?
Madam Chair, we have had discussions with the police, and as I've said, there's no complaints about physical complaints or any serious assault complaints or anything against Uber drivers.
Okay, I just wanted to go down a different road about issues that I've heard from the taxi industry, in which this committee's also heard from the taxi industry over the last year. 3 things in particular. One is the use of taxi stands, the taxi stands which are used in certain areas of town, whether in front of hotels or the train station or other places, and where representatives of the taxi industry have stated that Uber drivers have infiltrated those exclusive use areas. They have raised concerns at this committee. You have talked about your work that your officers have done, that you have followed up on areas that have been brought to your attention. Do you have any further comment on the type of work Ottawa Bylaw is doing to ensure that taxi stand exclusive use areas are exclusively being used by taxi drivers and not Uber drivers?
Madam Chair, I guess we on a daily basis we're in the field investigating these complaints. We have received complaints about Uber drivers utilizing taxi stands. In majority of those cases, the taxi stands are on private property, which aren't regulated under the bylaw. The taxi stands that they're prohibited to use are the ones that are on city street and approved by the city. And our experience so far is that we haven't seen any violations to date of Ubers utilizing those taxi stands on city street.
Okay, but if complaints continue to come in from the industry, you will commit to continue to investigate those complaints?
Madam Chair, absolutely we will.
Okay. Can you comment on whether there's any value in identifying Uber vehicles with a U sticker or some other identifier? Of course, taxis have identifiable signage on their rooftops. They have the plates on the back of the car. After 1 year, is there any value, particularly for Ottawa bylaw enforcement or even customers who are waiting outside? Yes, they can look at their app, but has staff looked at some jurisdictions require Uber vehicles to be identified? Is there any value in doing that in Ottawa?
Chair, colleagues from legal may be here as well, and I'll defer to them. Just on this, just a policy issue. This debate was a part of the Uber analysis before committee last year, and specifically this item was identified, debated, and council made the decision that no identification was part of it. So from a staff perspective, we haven't re-looked at that. We haven't gone back because the decision was made by this council not to have identification. I'm just a little worried that if we, and respectfully I understand the question, and I'll let Roger give an opinion operationally, but to get into that debate, it certainly would be reconsideration of the bylaw in any sense. So currently the rules which we work under that you've approved in the policy is Uber vehicles are not identified in any such manner. And so we haven't looked at that, although you may have an opinion, Mr. Chapman can answer, to get into the debate about whether we should or not. I'm just a little worried we start going down the slope of reconsideration, which is another debate to perhaps to have. So I'll let Roger answer that, but I just wanted to give that preamble, Chair.
Madam Chair, I'm not sure that I have an opinion either way. I mean, I'm not sure that there's any benefit to having the vehicles marked. I mean, we removed that requirement from the provisions of the licensing bylaws, or from the for limousines as well in the vehicle hire bylaw. And I'm not sure that there's any benefit. As you said, the app itself would allow a rider to be able to track the Uber vehicle, knows the license plate, make, model, color of the vehicle, and actually can see when the vehicle arrives to their destination. So I'm not sure that having the vehicle marked would have any benefit to anybody.
Just my final question, Madam Chair. The report states that, I'm just talking about the accessible fund that has been collected and is accruing funds. Staff anticipate a report will be coming in the spring with recommendations. Is that how to basically disseminate those funds, how to target those funds?
Chair, yeah, I'll answer that. You, council directed the general manager of EPS to follow up on your direction on that. So as you're aware, PTCs aren't covered under the ADOA accessibility law in Ontario. As such, however, you directed me to work with PTCs to have a levy which was done, and they volunteered the 7 cents. That amount, $450,000, the clear direction was to create a committee, a steering committee. We've had a first meeting, several members across the board as per your direction. And yes, directly to your question, the community will decide how best to disperse those funds for the accessible community, how they feel it would be best used, that money would be best used for value. So that's currently underway, and I should be reporting early next year on how that committee's suggesting and bring those recommendations for your approval.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington. Councillor Aglai.
Thank you very much. You showed us, as part of the slideshow, a map indicating where the rides were happening and the number of rides. Do we have similar data for the taxi industry?
Madam Chair, I don't have that data. I'm sure we could get something similar to that. I don't have that available today.
Okay. There's no rush, but it would be an interesting comparator if you can put that together. Just to follow up a little bit on what Councillor Brockton was talking about. So you had indicated, I believe in response to Chair Deans, that on the hotline question, there is no hotline, there's 311 that you would call if you had a concern about Uber. And again, depending on the nature of the concern, you may respond to it, or you may refer it back to Uber. So a couple of questions out of that. First is, do we have a formal process to make that referral back to Uber if it's something that's outside of our jurisdiction?
Madam Chair, yes, through knowledge-based articles with 311, we have clear indicators that what needs to be sent to Uber directly and what would be something they would create a service request and send to Bylaw to action.
And is there any review or reporting feature so that we know if a complaint came in that's outside of your bailiwick but was clearly within Uber's, that Uber's actually done something about it?
Madam Chair, so no requirement in the bylaw for us to do that, but we do monitor driver ratings, so we know based on a reduction of a specific driver's rating, we know that there's been complaints or activity that requires that rating to drop. So that would be an indicator for us.
But we can't track particular complaints. So to Councillor Brockington's point, if somebody phoned 311 and said, I was assaulted in the back of an Uber, that would be something the bylaw wouldn't deal with, I assume. What happens then? Is it simply just referred to Uber, or does 311 refer that to the police because that's a potential, like what happens?
If I may, Chair, Mr. Chapman's been identifying, maybe put in 3 buckets, and you've just identified one, Councillor. So certainly if anything of criminal nature would be referred to Ottawa Police, and we would have no access to that, and everyone understands they would do their process. Any complaint, as Mr. Chapman indicated, that would be related to some of the discussions we've had, parking at taxi stands, those type of things, would go directly to Uber. So if somebody calls 311, they have that information, and as Mr. Chapman was referring, the knowledge base data that we have. So 311 has a very clear script. Those things would go to Bylaw, they would be followed up, and we would ensure that the Bylaw that you've approved has been respected. Anything else, in simple terms, the model that was approved, it goes to the PTC organization, so it goes to Uber, and they would deal with it. We really don't have access. Okay. Mr. Chapman's indicating that there are indicators, there are ways we would get a feel, but in clear terms, that belongs to Uber from their business model to deal with complaints of service, and they have that. We don't have access, and that's not our role.
Okay, fair enough.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I just want to add one. So, again, the app itself is where most of those complaints would be received, right? So 311 hasn't received very many complaints about Uber drivers or any of that type of activity. So it's most times when the person's on their iPhone or whatever, they're sending any complaints that they do have or any concerns they have directly through the app to Uber. So it's not necessarily a call to 311.
Right, and so that leads to my next question. So you had said 311 would be the go-to, kind of, from the city perspective, but I would assume if somebody was assaulted or robbed or whatever, they may forego 311 and goes directly to the police, either 911 or the general occurrence number. Just for clarity's sake, I think you answered this question, Councillor Brockman, but as part of your review leading up to this, you've confirmed with the police that there have been no such complaints directly to the police, either through 911 or the general occurrence number?
Madam Chair, that's correct. Okay,
thank you for that clarification. So I want to talk a little bit about the Accessibility Fund, and I appreciate the report isn't in front of us. It's coming in 2018, and I think Mr. DeMonte, keep on wanting to call you Chief, Mr. DeMonte, that you had said you have a stakeholders group and it's across the board. Can you give us some like what's across the board? So who's part of your stakeholders group?
So, Chair, as part of the policy decisions that you made, you clearly defined who had to be members. So I chair the committee. Councillor Caudry is the council liaison on that committee. Bruce Wade is chair of the Accessibility Advisory Committee, which was one of the groups that you directed us to consult. Philip Turcott, who's also the vice chair, sits on the committee with me. Mr. Chapman, obviously, for Bylaw Regulatory Services. Paratranspo is represented as well, and My colleague John Manconi has directed Derek Washnuk to participate on behalf of Paratranspo. Lucille Berlinguet-Samur, which is the corporate accessibility branch of the city, which deals with many of those groups, is also on the committee. Ms. Hartick, who coordinated and helped us bring forward this bylaw, and Robert Grimwood of Transportation Planning Committee. So that's the group that makes up the steering committee that'll be discussing. We're going to be doing the normal process, public consultation, et cetera, and that group will take all that information, will provide a final report and recommendations, which then come back to you and then rise to council as to how the money should be dispersed to best serve this community.
Okay, and the quick follow-up on that issue. So the public consultation piece, you'll feed that through the councillors off so we can send it out through our channels? And
Chair, the typical normal process that we do for any public consultation through the city website, through your offices, 311, et cetera, the whole gamut, and we're working currently on preparing that for the new year.
Okay, slightly different question. So recently we've heard that Lyft is moving into Toronto and they're going to do a launch in Toronto very shortly. If I'm assuming if that's successful, they'll want to look at other options within the country, and of course Ottawa being the size we are in would likely be the next choice, I would think, if they're expanding in Ontario. Can you run us through what would Lyft have to do if they wanted to start operating in Ottawa in the new year? So what steps would they have to take in order to make that happen?
So, Madam Chair, I can tell you that we have already had a meeting with executives from Lyft, and we're aware that they are looking at entering the market here in Ottawa. And we have provided them with information that they require to meet the requirements of issuance of a license, and they do have a copy of the application as well. So we anticipate an application short period of time from them.
And and maybe you can or can't answer this, is there anything fundamentally different in the Lyft delivery model from Uber that would require you to come back to us and have a discussion about whether our bylaw is sufficient to not only the license, but to have oversight over the provision of a service through that company?
Madam Chair, so far I don't see any difference. I think they're very similar to the Uber model, and the requirements will be the same, access to their platform, things like that. So I don't anticipate any amendments required to the bylaw.
Okay, and I'm assuming if that changes, you'll come back and we'll have that discussion. Okay, and one final question on that. So you've said Lyft has been in discussions with you. Are there any other companies on the horizon we should be aware of that have expressed an interest in setting up in Ottawa?
There are other companies, but discuss necessarily when an application's made until a license is issued. So yes, we've had discussion with other companies, albeit smaller on scale, I would suggest. But so far, we one active application that we're reviewing right now. So there could be a third license issued in the near future. But so far, that's the only other application that we have under review.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Eglin. Councillor DeRose.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I just want to, I don't know what my colleague's been asking, but I have, did you say that you had 2,000 audit points that you've done in the last year?
Madam Chair, that's correct, 2,000 audits.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on how you do your audit?
Madam Chair, to speak specifically to what we do in an audit, may be detrimental to some ongoing investigations. But I can tell you that at the 6-month review, the data, we receive data daily from Uber. We receive data monthly from Uber. And audits are done on those downloads to ensure that the information that's required, or the requirements of the bylaw, are being met. So the vehicles are carrying, the drivers are carrying proper insurance, that they meet the requirements, the age requirements of the bylaw that they're required, the valid driver's license and things like that. So those are what the audits are about.
Is that including Quebec license plate on the cars that we're seeing any increasing, or are we auditing that specific item?
Madam Chair, that's correct. The Quebec plated vehicles are not permitted.
Are we also, when you say that we are monitoring the stand and the hailing, like, are we setting up a special team to making sure that Uber cars are not really hailing, or they're not hijacking stand that where taxi are allowed and they're not allowed? Because we've done, Councillor Brockington really brought a good point, and we've been hearing it again and again. The difference between the taxi and between Uber or another transportation company, that we allow the taxi company that they have a privilege on using this. That's one definite benefit for them. And now if we are allowing, and we're not really investing enough resources to making sure those Uber coming in and taking their fare, that's not really fair in the city. We keep saying that we need to make it fair, and I'm hearing from the taxi themselves and hearing from what's going on in the market that, so I think that within the money that we're raising, and I know we have an accessibility fund, and then I know that I appreciate the general manager is going to come back next year. You think maybe there is a need from special FTEs or putting extra resources to making sure these incidents are not happening?
So, Madam Chair, I can tell you that we have 5 dedicated staff, temporary staff, that were created in the implementation process of the Vehicle for Hire bylaw. So it's a different type of enforcement for us. This is new to us. There's a lot of different programs that we're running right now to be able to do audits, to be able to do spot inspections on the road, and other undercover work that we're doing. So those dedicated staff are in the field daily and are dedicated to the enforcement of this bylaw.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I'm not sure how this is going to happen, but I want to make sure that this really committee interested, and just want to make sure this is a priority for us in the city, to making sure these incidents will be minimized and it doesn't even happen at all. So I'm not going to give you direction, but I'm hoping that, I'm sure this committee will agree with making sure that spending some extra resources or making sure that Uber taxi are not hijacking stand for our taxi driver, that really appreciate it. And if you can keep your eye on it and making sure, keep it within the report back to our committee, I really appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Deroux. Councillor Kakish.
Thank you, Chair. And Roger, I was wondering if we have any information on the trips that taxis made in the past year.
So, as Madam Chair, again, they're not required to report that information to us. I can tell you that the KPMG report, I just deferred to Christine there, was KPMG report indicated that there was 12 million on an annual basis for taxis.
Okay, that was based on the report prior to last year.
Correct, yes.
And how many approximately complaints did you receive on taxis in the past year?
Madam Chair, I don't have that information available today. I can certainly follow up with you by the end of the day with that.
Okay.
Exactly how
I
many.
saw 0, which is what is being reported for the 6 million that Uber does, and I think Councillor Brockington raised some excellent points and questions, and I appreciate that when we did this framework as a compromise, and what we agreed to was that Uber and the city is a relationship and not everything in between there for whatever reasons we agreed to and debated last year. But I think at the same time, we've given you a big stick, and I think we also expect you to be proactive. And at one point when you responded, you said that you're not privy to some of that information. So I was wondering, is that because Uber's not prepared to share information with you? Yeah, and I know the ratings, and I appreciate all that information is public and it's there, but in terms of other potential incidents that may or may not be happening, you responded at one point saying there's information that I'm not privy to. So are you proactively asking for information that you're not getting, or is that because Uber's not prepared to share that information with the city?
Madam Chair, that's correct. We have asked Uber, as directed by the committee, 6-month report, and Uber, for reasons, including privacy reasons, have not shared that information with us to date.
Okay. And in terms of the, I think there's representatives from the police here as well. Is that correct? Or
Madam Chair, there is a representative from Ottawa Police here, but he's actually here for another,
okay.
for the...
But so we're not aware of any complaints or assaults or anything that have gone to OPS? Okay. Can the OPS rep confirm that, or he's not?
He's not, Madam Chair, sorry, the OPS ref here is for another file. He wouldn't have access to that information.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Kakish. Councillor Nussbaum.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions. First, to follow up from Councillor Kakish's question. So in the KPMG report, the annual number was roughly 12 million rides. And further to Councillor Eglai's question, we don't yet have the data for how many taxi rides were taken over that same period that Uber was in operation. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, that's correct. We don't have that information available.
And is that information that that you will have possession of, or does that require a voluntary disclosure from the various taxi company?
It's a good question. Something we'll have to ask the industry to see if they track that type of data. I'm sure they do, so we would be able to get that. I'm not sure about a heat map similar to the one that we had on display earlier that would indicate how many rides are actually taken in the downtown core, but I'll work with the industry to see what we can get.
Yeah, no, and obviously the reason I'm asking that is it'd be interesting to see where these 6 million rides are coming from. Are they new rides? Are they rides that used to be taxi rides? Are they transit rides? Are they people who are choosing not to use their own cars, et cetera? So that might help us fill in that picture a little bit. I want to move to Uber data for a moment. Uber started up, I guess, some years ago, a couple years ago, a data sharing program called Uber Movement, which is operating in, I know, a number of U.S. cities. Have we asked Uber if they can provide that sort of data publicly for Ottawa?
The data is required as part of the bylaw, so we are getting the ride data on a monthly basis. So I'm not sure what else here.
Well, I guess so. I think that's important. I think the question then is that information being put into a form that you're sharing with your colleagues in transportation and transit policy?
Madam Chair, yes, absolutely.
And so they're able to track that data, understand time of day, length of trip from a basic point of origin to a point of destination, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So that's great. I think that's very important. I imagine that is a rich mine of information for transportation and transit planners. The benefit of the movement program is that it provides that information in a publicly available format. So I guess my question is, have you asked Uber whether they would be willing to put that on their movement platform so that individual residents of Ottawa could see that information for themselves? So that's the first question.
So, Madam Chair, we haven't, but we will.
Excellent. Yeah, because obviously it would be better if they did it, probably much cheaper for us, because I do think that data would also be useful for average residents to see. It's great for transit and transportation planners, but I think in terms of an open data approach to this kind of information, it would be great if we could strongly encourage Uber to put that on a public platform. That's it, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Nussbaum. Anyone else? Seeing none, I just a couple of things that I just wanted to follow up on. The question about identifiers on PTC vehicles, and Mr. Chapman, you said that you didn't see any need for them. I would actually suggest the reason we didn't do it and the reason we shouldn't go down that path is because if you identify them, then it is, to Councillor DeRuza's point, more likely that they would receive ride hails, and they're not allowed to take ride hails, but if you identify them on the street, people may try and flag them. Not having an identifier on the vehicle takes away that opportunity and stays within the bylaw. I think that's all I have to say. I think the first year of operations sounds like the compliance is high, that Ottawa Police hasn't indicated any particular concern. Uber deals through an app with the complaints, and they will from their platform, and judging from the number of rides that they have given in Ottawa this year, it would seem that there is a market for that service and that Ottawans have embraced that service. So I obviously think that we need to continue to be diligent and make sure that everyone stays within the framework that Council has set out, and that we are able to adapt to change in the future and ensure the health of the taxi industry as well as the health of the emerging industry. But ultimately, we license for safety of the public, and the public had told us that they were looking for more competition in this marketplace, and I think through this bylaw it would appear that the first year has been quite successful in giving the public what they've been asking for. So thank you very much for being here. Received on the report? Okay, inquiries? Sorry, I forgot all about pawnbrokers. Okay, Councillor Fleury, the Pawnbroker Act.
Members of committee, I'd like to bring forward the direction to staff to come back with a report on the matter. Let me explain the reason why. As you hopefully have had a chance to read, there is an analysis by staff of the situation. I want to preface this by saying that there are two moving pieces. One, which is the ability for Ottawa Police to monitor stolen goods via sites like Kijiji, has made their analysis based on complaints much easier. And an historic license / Pawnbrokers Act, which is a provincial act, that continues to be outdated and problematic. Now, what I'm asking is simply to take the existing license that we have and amend it so that we can modernize it. And here's the situation. Right now, goods are found in pawn shops that are stolen. And there's no clear way for Ottawa Police or for Bylaw to monitor and enforce. The only way to do so, Madam Chair, is for an individual, a resident, who is finding an item that is stolen, to make their way to the pawn shop, to then flag that item to the Ottawa Police, for which then enforcement can begin. What I'm asking is for a review that would alleviate some of the issues that arose from the Privacy Commissioner's decision, not to identify necessarily the individual who's bringing the item to the pawn shop, but to mandate that the pawn shop post all of those items publicly on a given location. And the tool to cover those costs are the licensing fee. We can recoup all of the cost of setting up that data system to protect our community from theft by setting out that cost back to the providers as part of the licensing. So I don't feel that the report in front of us actually got into some of those options, and I'd love to see a report on that matter.
Okay, so just to be clear, you're asking for, you're giving a direction to staff to provide a full report on the Pawnbroker Act. Is that?
No, I'm asking for staff to come back with options in our licensing tools to modernize our license, to protect our community from stolen goods. And I've reached out to the Privacy Commissioner's office. I have spoken to them, and they're more than welcome to join the conversation and help staff to come up with a solution that does not breach the 2008 decision.
Okay, thank you. Just want to ask Mr. DeMonte if this is achievable in our work plan till the end of the term.
Sure, I think it would need to be a motion, and it's achievable, but it means something else has to get bumped. We're modifying our work plan to achieve the work plan that was approved by council, and we've had these discussions with you and other members. We're diligently working on completing that, but it's with the resourcing and the capacity and some of the, quite candidly, some of the work we have to do is significant. So if we took this on, we'll have to bump something else off, and that can be done.
Madam, I understand the parameters of the work plan. I'm not asking to. I'd love for it to be done this term, clearly, but if it's not in the realm of possible this term, I don't want to lose it as part of the item that it never comes up. I actually want a staff report, even if they were to introduce it as part of their work plan in the next term of council. I just don't want it to be lost. Okay. That is my request at today's committee.
Point of order?
Yep.
I guess my question is, as a direction or an inquiry is one thing, but it seems one member of council is asking for a report. And I'm looking at quirks that are legal, I guess. Is that permissible, or is that something we all have to vote on to devote the resources to a report as opposed to a memo or an inquiry?
Chair, just so we're understanding the same thing, council defined as a whole defined a work plan for us for reviews of bylaws. That's what we're talking about. So to change that, and I'll defer to legal, I would suggest that we're adding to that work plan. What the councillors now is asking is something different, and I think we can address that. But you would be changing council direction that staff got for the series of work that you asked us to complete in this term of council. What we're telling you as staff is, if you want that, if we add something to it, I don't know the legal question with regards to can you add something to it, or does council whole have to add something to it? We'd have to bump something, just our capacity.
No, and I appreciate that. I guess, though, in order to have a full report done and the reason assigned to that, whether it's this term or the beginning of next term, I'm just looking at legal. Is that a decision that one council member can make and direct it to happen, or is that something that needs to go to a vote to have a formal report done and those resources allocated to the particular issue?
If the work plan was approved by council, it would require for reconsideration under the rules. It would require a vote of not less. You'd have to have a not less than 1/3 of the minority, so 3/4 of the. So
a direction saying do a report isn't sufficient.
If that work plan was approved by council, yes.
And just to be 100% clear on this, if the council is asking that this be added to the work plan for the next term, is that possible at this point? I see your head no, but she's not saying anything.
Sorry to step in. If something's going to put staff off a current council-approved work plan, what is required by a council-approved process is staff would have to come, there would have to be a motion, and staff would come back and say, here, council, is what you would push us off, and council would have to make a decision based on that. We cannot pre-commit a future council. This council can't. They could ask that staff look at including it as part of their next term. and then staff could look at it with the balance of the rest of their priorities and report on that as part of their work plan, say we looked at it and here's where it fits. So
And
that's the appropriate.
Is that a direction?
It could be, if it's acceptable as a direction to look at it.
And Chair, to try to meet the objective of the council, that's what we were going to suggest is next term of council, as you know, we'll be coming back to you after we've completed this and say, what are your priorities next term? Council as a whole would do that. Certainly, we would ensure that that would be part of it. Council again would have to vote on that and make that part of the priorities, but we can ensure that continuity. But as just been indicated, I don't think you can't commit the next term of council. But we would ensure that would be on it. That's what we'd be trying to meet that objective of the council.
Okay, so I'm getting a nod from Councillor Fleury. So what we're doing here is giving a direction for staff to consider consider in the context of the next term of council's work plan, modernization of our licensing of the Provincial Pawnbrokers Act.
That's
okay?
Fine, Chair, and we'll assure that that's on the list.
Okay, Councillor Fleury.
Wrap up, and thank you for that, and thank you to my colleague as well, Keith Eglai, for bringing that. I want to follow the procedure. I don't want to bump any work that staff are undertaking. That's not the intent here. Once again, I want to clarify a few things. It's been apparent that stolen goods are found in our pawn shops, that there is not the right mechanisms to enforce it. I want to give, through this online portal, the opportunity for police, for community, and for our license team to actually fine pawnbrokers who are in breach of our licenses if they do not post online. So I just want to make sure that we don't get caught in the same analysis that was done this time. The Privacy Commissioner has highlighted to us they want to work with the city on a solution. So please never come back to say there's a Privacy Commissioner loop issue. The Privacy Commissioner did state to the current model challenges, but wants to work with us on modernization of our licenses. So I just want that to be clear.
Okay, so received on this report? Received. Okay, notices of motion?
I do.
Councillor Fleury.
Sorry, Madam Chair.
You're a busy guy these days.
I am, and you won't be surprised by the topic. I want to preface by I'd like to work with members of committee, members of staff, and members of the broader community if this motion can be clarified. I put some words to it, but I'd love for assistance in improving it. Alignment between land use policy requirements, shelter use, and agreements with the private operators of motels and hotels used as emergency shelter is the title of my notice. I'll read the whereas. Whereas it was learned through the Salvation Army 333 Montreal Road submission that the contract with the Ottawa Inn and the Concord Hotel along Montreal Road to offer family shelters has not required the city or the hotel owner to comply with the zoning use. And whereas these agreements are in place for well over a 5-year period and should align with all the policies at the City of Ottawa, and whereas the 2008 report entitled Rideau Vanier Ward 12 Interim Control Bylaw Study and Zoning Bylaw Amendment approved by Council made it very clear that as soon as one bed on a given site was used for shelter purpose for the property would be required to be zoned to include the use, and in order to reflect the goal of the Council from a zoning policy and also from a housing and homelessness objective, and whereas it is important that the city manager and the general manager of Social Services Department to have delegated authority on the matter for a use that would be less than a year and not require renewal without proper land use approval relating to shelters, and whereas the intent is to ensure that the operational needs of offering emergency services to our most vulnerable is available, and whereas confusion exists as the only compliance of these agreements, and whereas renewal clauses that exceed the 1 year would also require the owner to have the proper zoning uses on site, therefore be it resolved that the general manager of social services and or the city manager be required to review the contracts This would be prior to signing an emergency shelter rooms agreement with a private hotel or motel that is for a longer period than a year, and that the shelter use compliance be reviewed within the zoning prior to the agreement being signed to ensure that the zoning regulations and operational needs are aligned.
Okay, could you repeat that? No, just kidding. Councillor, the next meeting is December 7th, and the clerk's indicating to me that it wouldn't be possible for the staff to be ready for that meeting. The meeting after that is the meeting that we're considering housing and homelessness, which is in February. So with your agreement, we would move that to the February meeting.
No problem. And as I said, this is a work in progress. I can certainly circulate it. It's for members of staff and committee to work with me on something that it's tangible.
Okay, so just so everyone knows, this would go to the February meeting. Okay? Any other notices of motion? Inquiries? Adjourned.